I should say, in fairness and balance, that we've reviewed the most recent HMIC inspection of the force, which wasn't a child protection inspection, it was a PO inspection, I think, and it was found that the backlog issue had been more or less resolved precisely because of some of the measures you mentioned about regional collaboration. I won't take you to that document, but okay. we have it and we've reviewed it.
Thanks.
Can we turn just to page 6 of this particular report? We see that the recommendation at the top of this page is about training on safeguarding children. We can skip the first few paragraphs and just go to the end of this page. I'll summarize given the time. So there's a mention of a review carried out in 2015 in anticipation of an influx of new staff to meet increases in demand in public protection and because of an unprecedented number of staff retiring in child abuse units. Carries on at the top of page 7, resulted in the transfer of a significant number of inexperienced officers to those specialist posts. At the time of the review, not all officers investigating child protection cases had received essential training. And there's in the next paragraph, there's an account of the effect of this. The limited safeguarding experience of new staff have impacted adversely on the quality of investigations and resulted in missed investigative opportunities and failure to safeguard the most vulnerable children. This was evident in the audit of 26 child protection cases, 6 good, 10 requiring improvement, 10 inadequate. If I can take you just briefly to the top of page 8. There's a case specifically involving, at least in part, online child sexual abuse. A 12-year-old girl had sent naked and graphic images of herself to men on social media showing penetration with an object. The child's natural father, a registered sex offender, had been convicted previously of downloading indecent images of children. There's a discussion of what happened to a sibling.
And we'll stop you there for a minute. Why is that dad still got custody of that child? The CPS not doing the fucking job again.
At the end of the paragraph, no joint investigation or strategy discussion took place in this case, and the investigation was closed without wider safeguarding issues being considered. There's then a paragraph with respect to supervision, and it's found that supervision was, I quote, superficial and lacking in rigor, had not resulted in an improvement to the timeliness or quality of investigations in a number of cases. And we see the recommendation in bold there. We recommend that no later than 31 May 2015, the constabulary allocates every investigation to an officer trained in child protection with the skills, capacity and competence to undertake it. Can you help me with whether and to what extent this recommendation has been implemented, at least with respect to online child sexual abuse?
So what's articulated there is, I mentioned in the first page of the statement about the 2 restructures. The restructure in 2014 is when we went to the wider investigation teams and stopped having the specialist teams. During that process, people asked where would they like to work in the new model, and a lot of our child protection officers decided that they fancied changing where they were working and to do something different. In addition, we had the retirements, and that had an impact in terms of our organisational knowledge, expertise and resilience in that area. So that was recognised, and what we've done is we've maximised the number of the specialist child abuse investigating development courses since then, and we've put, I think it's 6 each year on, and each can fit 12 to 15 people on the course. So we've tried to build that resilience up in terms of it, and then we've also spoken to child protection staff in terms of what would help them do the role, what would support them within it, and try to build those things in to support the role in terms of what they want to do as a sense of vocation and how we can support them in achieving that. So
stop you there. So as a restructuring process, he's saying that when they restructured the organisation that he works for, they let people go, even though the problem was increasing, they restructured in a way that deteriorised their organisation. That fucking makes sense, mate, that does. That makes you a fucking grand person for your job.
In terms of that, there's then the latter point about the management and oversight, and that's something that we've picked up probably for the last year and a half to 2 years, trying to bring in that management supervision and rigour. In terms of the individual incident involved, when we went through the structure, what we have now is investigation of child protection sitting in my world, and what we call the Safeguard Coordination Unit, which manages referrals. So if there's a concern for a child, that referral will go into the Safeguard Coordination Unit. They would do the research, they would do the information sharing with other agencies, and then they'll do the coordination of what multi-agency response is required. So it's that process that should prevent that kind of incident happening again.
Can we move forward in the chronology and talk specifically about funding? If we can turn to tab 4, please, and put up OHY 003125 on the screen. So this is a table of ICAT's funding from 2014-2015 to 2017-2018. We can go straight to the bottom row for the figures of the budget, which is on the right-hand side of every row. We see the budget of £271,000 in 2014-2015, rising slightly in 2015-2016, substantial rise in 2016-2017, and a very substantial rise to the figure of just over £700,000 in 2017-2018. I understand there was a business case that was put forward for increased funding in early 2016 or so. Can you tell us about the genesis of that business case and at what stage it was accepted by the management of the force?
So I came into that post in January 2016, and the issues in terms of the ICAT and their resource levels, I would have said, was my immediate short-term priority. So in terms of that, the Chief Constable came in that February, and by the March we had put together the business case of what we thought was required. We knew what demand was likely to be potentially coming in, and we were trying to put in the resources to be able to manage that demand. There was a number of different options there, and you have to remember this was in the context of the comprehensive spending review and a wider savings project, but I thought the need was such that we put in the most extensive proposal in terms of cost as the one we preferred and wanted supported, and it was supported by the constabulary on the back of that.
So you allocated all the funds that you asked for?
Yes.
I'd like to explore now the effects of the increased funding, and perhaps it's a convenient point now to go back to paragraph 2.5. So we talk about the increase in positive outcomes from 24% in May 2015, 24% from September 2015 to May 2016, to 45.5% from May 2016 to July 2017. How much of an influence did the increased funding have with improving that figure?
None. I'll answer that.
If I'm being honest, the short answer is I don't know. So it may be the increased resourcing. I think it's equally likely that around that time we developed capabilities that I think gave us the ability to get a much higher outcome rate for that particular measure. I can't tell you which one played a greater part.
Do you happen to know ICAT's budget for the 2018-2019 financial year?
I don't. My intuitive view would be that it would be the same.
Do you know fuck all, don't you?
And if I can take you briefly to tab 9, this is the Strategic Threat Assessment published by the Constabulary for 2017-2018. Could we please put up OHY 003403 the screen? And could we turn please to page 43? Under the heading Austerity Measures, I'll just read the salient bits. Failure to set a sustainable, balanced budget remains a key risk to the Constabulary, and there's an explanation of the reasons for that failure. The last sentence, the force is targeting savings through collaboration in the delivery of its enabling services functions. However, further savings beyond those from enabling services will be needed. You'll anticipate my question, which is to what extent can the present level of ICAT funding be maintained or indeed increased given the trend of increase in referrals, among other things?
Yeah.
So I think it's really important to give the context of that. So the way we talked about that last bit was sounding quite dry. So you remember March 2016, that was a significant increase in resourcing. That's the last increase in resourcing of that nature anywhere across the Constabulary I'm aware of. Later that year, we then went into a programme to reduce the cost of operational policing by £5 million. So since 2010, my understanding is we've saved £65 million from our budget, and we've got 650 fewer officers as a result of that. We still have 17
And how many more
save
fucking crimes, you
21,
fucking
22.
prick?
So I don't think realistically, necessarily, I would get more funding to support the ICAT. It would be how would we redivide the cake if we wanted more resource in that area in terms of it. So additional funding to expand any unit now is a real challenge. So in terms of what's been described there, I think what we have to do is just, when we look at strategic priorities, it's not where do we invest funding, is what decision do we make if we want to support that area more. Does that make sense?
No,
So
it doesn't.
If we
It doesn't
assume
make
that
fucking
the funding
sense.
level will remain flat in the foreseeable future, that's the best case scenario, it sounds like. What plans are being put in place to be able to deal with the increasing demand coming through?
So at the minute, the demand over the last 18 months to 2 years for the ICAT team is varied. It's really moved around month by month, and I think at the minute we're looking for it to stabilise to a level. It may come down. The underlying trend we expect to increase, but what we've seen over the last year may stabilise, may come down a little bit.
And why is
I
that?
think the conversation's more in terms of what decisions do we make in terms of how do we manage that demand. Do we further support the ICAT, or do we make a decision about some of the lower risks going out against the wider investigations team in the way it currently does to a greater extent? It's those kind of conversations to...
And how has he come to the conclusion that the crime rate of child abuse is going to stabilise? How the fuck has he come to that conclusion, you prick?
Decisions in terms of what's our overall demand, how do we prioritise it, and then how do we reallocate what we have to make most effective management of threat, risk and harm and what the public expect from us.
Is the trend towards farming out more and more cases from ICAT to investigation teams and uniformed officers, given that pressure on ICAT?
So, again, my aspiration would be that all of these images are dealt with in the ICAT. It depends if that's a realistic proposition or not, and then how do we manage it? Are there forces that have developed ways to manage that demand more effectively? Is there decisions about how we do that as a process that we need to make? So it's not a hard and fast decision of here's the strategic threat, here's the demand, resources go there. At the minute we're saying how can we most effectively reshape ourselves as policing on the money we have available to do the things we have to do and meet the threats that we know are there. So I can't give you a hard and fast answer, we would do this or we would do that. We would look at what the issue was and the challenge, and then review all the options to come to an agreed position as to what's the best proposal.
Can we just take one example in terms of how the force is coping with capacity and demand pressures? We turn to your second statement behind tab 2. Turn to the second page of that.
Oh, my soul, burn him again.
Paragraph.
Burn him again.
4. There's quite a long discussion, if I can summarize the gist of it. You say there that at least of the cohort of registered sex offenders who are managed by the constabulary of 1937, at least 131 were convicted of offences relating to indecent images of children and are subject to a sexual harm prevention order. You go on to say that as those types of orders only came into existence in March 2015, there will be some other offenders who are subject to a sexual offences prevention order, but you aren't able to collect those numbers easily. And you say at the end of the paragraph, third from the bottom, the actual number would be significantly more. That's why you've said at least 131 could be significantly more than that. I just want to explore the extent to which the force is able to monitor compliance with these orders. Just before I do that, can you help us with what sort of conditions are typically placed on offenders who are convicted of indecent images of children offences and receive an ancillary order of some kind? What sort of conditions are put on them?
I don't have the level of knowledge to be able to tell you in detail. My expectations would be around their contact with children and how that's managed, and their use of technology, and
Oh my God.
what the expectations are of them in relation to that. I'm not in a position to be able to tell you examples of conditions that have been given, I'm afraid.
How is compliance with those conditions monitored by the force?
So there's obviously legislation that sets out the requirements in terms of that. So I think within the statement itself it talks about the different things that we do in terms.
That shows how much he cares, that does. Not one case he's looked at, he's followed it through to find out what the outcome was. Not one single case, because he can't remember a single case of it. You horrible, horrible man.
Of some of the multi-agency work, the offender manager work, and what's required in terms of that. So I'd have to find a relevant statement to tell you that beyond that detail. But in terms of what we do to manage it, the guidance sets out quite, again, categoric numbers of how many times certain risk categories of offenders should be managed. And I think we're moving more towards, again, what does the risk assessment tell us, and then what does the professional judgment tell us? So rather than slavishly adhering to a set number, if there's someone that we've got more concern of, we're going to visit them more, and if there's some that we've got less concern about, we wouldn't necessarily adhere to the thing just for the sake of it. It's more in terms of what's the most effective way of managing that cohort of offenders.
And as that move towards a more risk assessment based approach, is that sort of mainly resource driven, do you think?
I've not been directly involved in the offender management world to say it's directly resulting. It would obviously be a factor. You know, the cohort's growing, I think, by about 10% a year or something in that kind of region. So that is a challenge in terms of, again, how do we manage that responsibility and that requirement with the resources and the budget we have in the context of wider policing.
Can I just ask you one more question, Mr. White? This is on the subject of industry. There's material on this in your second statement from paragraph 13 onwards. Just one point. I appreciate you've said quite a lot here, but just to pick up on one point. At paragraph 9.2, you say most internet service providers, and I understand you use that term in the broader sense, including social media platforms and so forth. apologies, first statement, paragraph 13, page 13, paragraph 9.2. So you say that most internet service providers have a dedicated single point of contact, but you go on to say it remains a significant challenge in the increasing number of internet service providers without a dedicated law enforcement portal. How do you contact internet service providers, social media companies who lack a law enforcement portal, as you put it?
I couldn't give you a definitive answer on that. So I assume we will find a point of contact somewhere within the organisation. It's just, I know what's been highlighted is where those companies have provided that single point of contact for us for all these requests, that immediately improves the response we get and how the whole process works. So I don't know exactly how we do it, about finding a point to be able to deal with inquiries outside of that. We will find it, I'm sure, no doubt. The point being made was that spot position does make a huge difference where it exists.
Those are my questions. Chair, do you or the panel have any questions?
Just one point of clarification, please, Mr. White. When you refer to the base budget not increasing now, does that in fact mean it will buy less because of annual cost of living increases?
Potentially. I think what I could confidently say, as far as I'm aware, is I'm not aware of any expansion of the resourcing or the staffing of that unit.
What, your wages?
So there may be some slight changes with the budget in terms of
your pay rise,
equipment or something of that nature.
Yeah.
And then in terms of how inflation works and the impact of our budget on the result of that, then
the BMW.
The usual impact of a static budget is that it purchases less service one way or another.
yes.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. In relation to the recorded outcomes that you've set out in your second statement, is the force in any way measured on the number of positive outcomes as opposed to other outcomes? Are there performance targets or the like?
So we've very much moved away from performance outcomes and the strong performance culture we had probably 5 years ago. So there's not the same scrutiny in the same way.
No shit.
What we would do is much more in terms of our constabulary management boards. We would look at that data around outcomes in terms of what does that tell us. We may do comparative benchmarking with other forces to see are we very different and is there something we need to look at in relation to that. But then importantly we would do qualitative detailed assurance work around individual cases in the same way that HMRC would to give us that reassurance. So yes, there is review of the outcomes, but not in the way they would have been 5 years ago.
Thank you. And in relation to outcome 21, which is further investigation not in the public interest police decision, which we've heard evidence about is used as an outcome in relation to the exchange of images between young people, not for an illegal purpose but for exploring sexuality, for example. Has any review on whether outcome 21 has been properly and appropriately used been undertaken in the constabulary?
I know that our force crime registrar has done an assurance report in relation to it. I couldn't tell you the exact findings of it, but I know in terms of it, it will be increasingly important in the year coming ahead. What we've looked at, and certainly what we picked up from the HMIC work last autumn, was a much more nuanced understanding in terms of where there's offending from a young person, but there's also victimisation, and how do we get the balance right in terms of managing risk and not criminalising too extensively young people. So yes, there's been an assurance report. I can't tell you the findings, but in terms of the direction of travel, it's something that we absolutely need to do much more of and understand much more beyond sexting and the exchange of sexualised images, but much more in terms of exploitation and abuse of young people and their related problematic behaviour.
Thank you. Sir Malcolm.
Thank you. Yes, just one question, and forgive me if I did not quite understand. This is going back to the figures in 8.12, where a question was put to you about the 29% of cases which were referred to ICAT which were filed under no further action, and you gave a helpful account of why that might be the case in some instances. However, perhaps I was misunderstanding you. I thought that you had implied earlier that it was only those that had come through the KIRAT system as a high rating that would be passed on in the first place to ICAT at the moment. So what I'm wondering is there a problem with the risk assessment producing them as being high to be passed on, or is there still some reason why some that may be being passed on as categorised initially as high turn out not to be pursued?
No, you keep pulling that thread, bud.
So
the problem with ICAT
incidents that come through the communication centre or the incident assessment unit, the referrals who come for this type of work directly into ICAT from the NCA, and then the person receiving that will put that on Niche, which is our incident and crime recording system. There will then be the intelligence research done around it, including the KIRAT risk assessment, and then the decision as to where it should be allocated. Some of those will be the referral will then be followed up with the actual image involved being forwarded on from the NCA, and at that stage, once it's already on our system and we were doing the risk assessment, it may turn out that the image wasn't quite as we initially thought, and it may be recategorised on our crime recording system as a result. So that's the process.
Let me just stop him there. Bear in mind, everything that he's just said, that process that it goes through, you've got to remember that he's just told us that the people employed in ICAT are incompetent, untrained work people, yeah? So they're incompetent, untrained staff. And that's no wonder that they all get turned away. Disgrace.
It comes in, recorded, intelligence research, assessment, allocation to the appropriate department, and then progression.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Griffin.
You're sweating, bud. You're sweating. What's up?
Chair, there is some further red evidence to go through this afternoon, but looking at the time, I wonder if it would be a good moment for an afternoon break.
I'll applaud that, man.
We'll return at 3:15.
Whoever that bloke was, that barrister, that solicitor, I applaud you. Fantastic. Grilled that guy to bits.